The day I walked into that courtroom, I already knew I had lost. Not just the case, not just my money, but something deeper. Something personal. And the worst part? I wasn't walking in alone. Sitting in those hard wooden benches, lined up like they were there for a show, was my entire family. My parents. My cousins. Even my older brother who hadn't spoken to me in years. They were all there not to support me, but to watch me fail. You ever get that feeling where the room is full, but somehow it feels completely silent? Like every breath you take is too loud, every step echoes a little too much? That's exactly how it felt. I could feel their eyes on me before I even looked up. Some of them didn't even try to hide it. The whispers, the smirks, the quiet judgment, it all hit at once. And in that moment, standing there in front of the judge, I realized this wasn't just about bankruptcy. This was about every argument, every doubt, every time they said I wouldn't make it. 15 years ago, I had big plans. I wasn't trying to be reckless or careless. I genuinely believed I could build something of my own. I poured everything into my small business. Every hour, every dollar, every bit of hope I had. But things didn't go the way I imagined. One bad decision turned into another. A deal fell through. Bills started piling up. And before I knew it, I was drowning in debt with no way out. When I finally filed for bankruptcy, it felt like admitting defeat. But I didn't expect it to turn into a public spectacle. Somehow, word got around. Maybe someone in the family talked, maybe it spread faster than I thought. But by the time the hearing came, it was like everyone had decided this was something they needed to see for themselves. I remember locking eyes with my father for just a second. He didn't smile. He didn't frown either. Just disappointment. That quiet kind that says more than words ever could. My mother looked away when I glanced at her. My brother leaned back in his seat like he was watching a movie he already knew the ending to. And maybe he did. The judge started speaking, but I barely heard the words. All I could think about was how I got there. How everything I worked for had led to this exact moment. And how the people who were supposed to stand by me were instead sitting there, waiting for it all to collapse. When the final decision was announced, it felt like the air got sucked out of the room. Just like that, it was over. Years of effort gone. Reputation damaged. Pride completely shattered. I didn't look back as I walked out. I couldn't. Because I knew what I'd see, faces that confirmed every fear I had about myself. That day changed me in ways I didn't understand at the time. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up to family events. Slowly, distance turned into silence. And silence turned into something permanent. For a long time, I told myself it didn't matter. That I didn't need their approval. That I could just move on and rebuild on my own. But rebuilding isn't easy when you're starting from nothing. There were nights I questioned everything. Nights I wondered if they were right about me all along. If maybe I really wasn't cut out for anything more. And honestly, there were moments I almost gave up completely. But something inside me refused to stay down. It didn't happen overnight. There was no sudden breakthrough, no lucky moment where everything turned around. It was slow. Painfully slow. Small steps, small wins, and a lot of setbacks in between. I took jobs I never imagined I'd take. I learned things the hard way. And bit by bit, I started putting the pieces back together. Years passed. Life moved on. And eventually, the memory of that courtroom started to feel like something distant. Something from another lifetime. Until one day, it wasn't. Because exactly 15 years later, I found myself standing outside another courtroom. Same building. Same heavy doors. But this time, everything was different. I wasn't the one being called in to explain my failure. I was there for something else. And as I pushed those doors open and stepped inside, I saw something that stopped me cold. They were all there again. Same faces. Same family. But this time, they weren't expecting what was about to happen. For a second, I just stood there, frozen. It felt like time folded in on itself. Same courtroom, same rows of benches, same uneasy silence. But this time, I wasn't the one being watched with pity. Or at least, I didn't think I was. Their eyes shifted toward me one by one, and I could tell they were trying to figure it out. Why I was there. What I was doing back in a place that once marked the lowest point of my life. I kept my face calm, but inside, everything was moving fast. Memories hit me in flashes. That old feeling of being judged, of being less than, it tried to creep back in. But it didn't stick the way it used to. I had spent years building something stronger than that. Still, seeing them all together again like this, it stirred things I thought I had buried for good. No one came up to me. No one said a word. My mother looked like she wanted to, but she stayed in her seat. My father didn't even nod. My brother just stared, the same way he did 15 years ago, like he was trying to read the ending before it happened. And maybe he thought he already knew it. I took a seat on the opposite side of the room this time. Not with them. Not near them. Close enough to see everything but far enough to make a point. I wasn't there to be part of their circle anymore. That chapter had closed a long time ago. As I sat down, I noticed something else. A few unfamiliar faces. Lawyers maybe. People shuffling papers, whispering in low voices. The air felt tense, like something important was about to unfold. But no one was saying it out loud. And that made it heavier somehow. I glanced toward the front, toward the same place where I once stood trying to hold myself together. It looked smaller now. Or maybe I just felt bigger. It's strange how perspective changes when life pushes you hard enough. 15 years is a long time. Long enough to lose people. Long enough to rebuild from nothing. But also long enough to carry questions that never really got answered. And sitting there, in that same room, I realized some of those questions were still alive. Back then, when everything fell apart, I kept wondering how it got so bad without anyone noticing. Or maybe they did notice and just chose to stay quiet. That thought stayed with me for years. Not as anger, but as something quieter. Something that made me pull away piece by piece. I didn't just lose money during that time. I lost trust. I lost connection. I lost the version of myself that believed family would stand with you no matter what. And once that belief cracks, it's hard to put it back together the same way. But I didn't come back here for answers. At least that's what I told myself. A door opened near the front and a few people walked in together. That's when the energy in the room shifted. Conversation stopped. Papers went still. Everyone sat a little straighter. Even my family leaned forward like they didn't want to miss a single detail. I watched closely, trying to read what was happening without asking anyone. One of the men looked nervous, adjusting his tie over and over again. Another person, older, calm, almost too calm, walked beside him. There was something about the way they carried themselves that made it clear. This wasn't just another routine hearing. And then I noticed something else. My brother exchanged a quick glance with my father. It was subtle, but I caught it. Like they already knew more than they were letting on. Like they had been expecting this moment. That didn't sit right with me. Because if they knew what was going on, why was I just finding out now? I leaned back slightly, keeping my eyes forward but my mind racing. I hadn't spoken to any of them in years. Not really. A few short messages here and there, mostly ignored. No real conversations. No explanations. Just distance. So how did we all end up in the same place at the same time again? It couldn't be a coincidence. Not after everything that happened. The judge entered and the room stood up. That same routine. That same structure. But this time it felt different. I wasn't nervous in the same way. I wasn't waiting to be judged. But I was waiting for something. The case started and names were called. I listened carefully, trying to connect the pieces. Some of it made sense. Some of it didn't. There were mentions of financial disputes, business dealings, numbers that sounded way too familiar. Too close. I felt a small knot form in my chest. Because the more I listened, the more it started to sound like a story I already knew. Different names, different faces, but the pattern, it felt the same. Risk, loss, pressure, and something deeper underneath it all. Something hidden. I glanced back at my family again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. They weren't just watching. They were tense. Not the kind of tension you feel when you're waiting for someone else to fail. This was different. This was the kind that comes when you're worried about what might come out. And that's when it hit me. Whatever was about to happen in that room, it wasn't just about the people standing in front of the judge. It was connected. Somehow, in a way I didn't fully understand yet, it was tied to me too. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I could feel it. And as the hearing moved forward, one name was mentioned that made everything inside me go still. A name I hadn't heard in years. A name that shouldn't have been there. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't just a return to the past. This was something else entirely. Something that had been building for a long time. And it was finally about to come to the surface. The name echoed in my head long after it was said. I didn't react right away, at least not on the outside. But inside it was like something had been pulled loose. That name belonged to someone who had been part of my story back when everything started falling apart. Someone I hadn't thought about in years, mostly because I forced myself not to. I leaned forward slightly, trying to stay focused on what was being said next. The details started coming together slowly. Business partnerships. Failed investments. Missing funds. It was all wrapped in legal language, but underneath it I could hear the same story I lived through, just told from a different angle. And then it clicked. This wasn't just a random case. This was connected to the kind of deals I used to chase. The kind that looked promising at first, full of opportunity, until you realized too late that something wasn't right. Back then, I didn't have the experience to see the warning signs. I trusted too quickly. I believed what I was told because I wanted it to be true. Now, sitting in that courtroom again, I couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe I wasn't the only one who got pulled into something like that. I looked toward my family again, more carefully this time. My father's posture was stiff, his jaw tight. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap, but her fingers kept moving like she was trying to stay calm. And my brother, he wasn't relaxed anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on the front, but there was tension in his face that hadn't been there before. They knew something. That much was clear. The question was, how much? I tried to think back to those early days before everything collapsed. There were conversations I didn't fully understand at the time. Moments that felt off but didn't seem important enough to question. I had been so focused on proving myself, on building something that would finally make them take me seriously, that I ignored things I probably shouldn't have. There was one deal in particular. I hadn't thought about it in years, but now it came back in pieces. It was introduced to me through someone close. Not a stranger. Not a cold call. Someone who had a connection to the family, which made it feel safe. Too safe. At the time, I didn't question it. Why would I? It felt like support, like someone was finally giving me a chance. But looking back now, I couldn't remember all the details clearly. Just fragments. Meetings, numbers, promises that sounded just convincing enough. And then things started to go wrong. The money didn't move the way it was supposed to. Deadlines got pushed. Explanations became harder to follow. And by the time I realized something was off, I was already too deep in it. That was the beginning of the spiral that led me to that first courtroom. I always blamed myself for that. For not being careful enough. For not asking more questions. But sitting here now, I wasn't so sure anymore. The case in front of me kept unfolding, and every new detail felt like it was brushing up against something from my past. Not exactly the same, but close enough to make me uneasy. There were patterns, ways people talked, the kind of language used to explain things away. I recognized it, and that recognition made me uncomfortable. Because if I could see it now so clearly, then someone else must have seen it back then too. Someone with more experience, more understanding. Someone like my father. The thought hit me harder than I expected. I didn't want to believe it. I had spent years making peace with the idea that my failure was my own. That it was something I needed to carry, learn from, and move on. But what if that wasn't the full story? What if there were parts of it I never got to see? I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the feeling, but it stayed. The room felt smaller again, like the walls were closing in just a little. Not in the same way as before, but enough to remind me that I wasn't as detached from this as I thought. A voice from the front pulled me back in. One of the lawyers was speaking, laying out a timeline. Dates, transactions, decisions. As they spoke, I noticed something that made my focus sharpen instantly. One of the dates matched a time I remembered clearly. A time when everything started to fall apart for me. That couldn't be a coincidence. I felt my chest tighten slightly, but I kept my expression neutral. I didn't want anyone to notice. Not yet. I glanced over again, slower this time, more controlled. My brother's eyes shifted for a split second, just enough to catch mine. And in that brief moment, there was something there I hadn't seen before. Not judgment. Not distance. Something closer to concern. But it disappeared just as quickly as it came. That made it worse somehow. Because now I knew, whatever was happening in this room wasn't just uncomfortable. It mattered. And maybe, it had always mattered. The hearing continued, but my thoughts kept circling back. To that deal. To those early choices. To the people involved. And to the possibility that I hadn't been alone in it the way I always believed. If that was true, then it meant one thing. There were answers out there I never got. And they were closer than I thought. As another name was mentioned, connected to the same chain of events, I felt that same unease rise again. The story wasn't just repeating itself, it was expanding. Pulling in more pieces, more connections. And somewhere in all of it, was the truth I had been missing for 15 years. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that finding that truth wouldn't be simple. Because if my family was involved in any way, directly or indirectly, then this wasn't just about business or money anymore. This was personal. And whatever came next, wasn't going to stay inside that courtroom. The more the hearing went on, the harder it became to sit still. Every sentence from the front of the courtroom felt heavier than the last, like each word was carefully placed to build something I still couldn't see fully. But I could feel it forming. A picture. A connection. Something that had been hidden for a long time and was now being pulled into the light piece by piece. I kept my eyes forward, but my mind wasn't sitting in that room anymore. It was moving backward, pulling through memories I had tried to leave behind. Meetings that didn't make sense at the time. Conversations that felt too quick, too controlled. People nodding at things I didn't fully understand, and me just going along because I thought trust was enough. Trust. That word didn't feel as simple anymore. A sudden shift in the courtroom brought me back. A document was being passed around. There was a pause. A long one. The kind that makes people uncomfortable without anyone needing to say a word. I noticed the judge leaned forward slightly, reading more carefully now. Even the lawyers looked different, less confident, more cautious. And then I saw it. One of the names on the document matched someone I remembered clearly from my past. Not a business partner I had chosen, but someone who had been introduced to me through connections I thought were reliable. That introduction had been the start of everything. Or at least that's what it felt like now. I felt my fingers tighten slightly in my lap. Across the room, my father shifted in his seat. Not much, but enough. My mother was no longer looking down. She was staring at the front now, fully focused. And my brother? He had stopped pretending to be relaxed altogether. Something was building. And everyone in that room could feel it. The lawyer speaking paused for a moment, flipping through pages. Then came another name. This one landed differently. It wasn't just familiar. It was tied to a specific moment in my life. A decision I made under pressure. A moment where I had been told everything was safe, everything was under control. But now, hearing it in this context, it didn't sound safe at all. It sounded coordinated. My chest felt tight again, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't afford to react. Not here. Not yet. I needed to understand what was happening first. I needed to hear everything. The courtroom felt like it was shrinking again. The same walls, the same structure, but now it felt like every seat was occupied by something heavier than just people. History. Decisions. Consequences that had been waiting a long time to surface. And then something happened that changed the entire rhythm of the room. A new set of documents was brought forward. These ones weren't part of the earlier discussion. I could tell by the reaction alone. The way the lawyers leaned in. The way the judge adjusted their posture. Even the air felt different, like the room had shifted into a more serious gear. My eyes stayed locked on the front, but I could feel my family more than I could see them now. Like their presence had become louder without them moving at all. The name from earlier came up again. This time it wasn't just mentioned. It was connected. Linked to transactions. Agreements. A chain that started to stretch across multiple years. Across multiple cases. And somewhere in that chain, I was mentioned. Not directly at first. At least not clearly. But enough for me to notice. Enough for me to understand that my past wasn't as separated from this as I once believed. I felt a slow, uncomfortable realization building in my chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something deeper. Something more complicated. Like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for years were finally being placed in front of me, but not in the way I expected. My father leaned slightly toward the lawyer seated near him. A quiet exchange. Quick. Controlled. But I saw it. My mother noticed too. Her expression changed just slightly, like she was trying to process something she didn't want to accept. And my brother, he stood up halfway then stopped. Like he had almost made a decision but thought better of it. That moment told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were involved. Maybe not in the way I first imagined. Maybe not in the way I feared. But involved enough that this wasn't just a hearing about someone else's mistakes. This was something that reached into our history, our decisions, our silence. I swallowed hard, keeping my face steady. The lawyer at the front continued speaking, now laying out a sequence of events that stretched back further than I expected. Years overlapping. Transactions tied together in ways that weren't obvious at first glance, but became clearer with every explanation. And then came the part that made everything inside me go still. A reference to the bankruptcy case. My case. I felt my breath slow for a second. Not because I didn't understand what was being said, but because I did. It wasn't just being mentioned. It was being connected. Linked to earlier decisions. Earlier movements. Earlier agreements that I had never seen the full picture of. I heard a soft sound from my right. My mother. A small inhale, like she had been holding her breath for too long. My father didn't move this time. Not at all. And that scared me more than anything else. Because stillness usually means control. And control usually means knowing more than you're saying. The judge asked a question. The room waited for an answer. But no one spoke immediately. That pause stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for tension to build into something almost unbearable. I felt like I was sitting at the edge of something massive. Something that had been moving under the surface for years without me realizing it. And now it was finally rising. Slowly. Carefully. like it had been waiting for this exact moment. I looked forward again, and that's when I saw it. One final document being prepared. Something new. Something that hadn't been revealed yet. The lawyer held it in their hands, ready to speak. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not silence from confusion. Silence from anticipation. My heart slowed just slightly as I watched them take a breath before speaking again. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was about to be said next was going to change everything I thought I understood about that day 15 years ago. And possibly, about my entire family. The room didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a pressure cooker that had been running for years and was finally reaching its limit. Everyone was waiting, but no one wanted to admit it out loud. Even the smallest sound, the shuffle of papers, the slight movement of a chair, felt louder than it should have. The lawyer finally lifted the document. That alone changed the energy in the room. I noticed it immediately. My father's hand tightened around the edge of the bench. My mother didn't even blink. My brother leaned forward just slightly, like he was bracing himself for something he already knew was coming. And then the name was spoken. Not just mentioned this time. Not buried inside explanations or timelines. This time it stood alone. Clear. Direct. Connected to everything that had been building up in the hearing so far. But what came after that name wasn't what I expected. Because it wasn't just about financial records or old business deals. It was about intent. A series of decisions that were described in a way that made the entire situation feel different. Not like mistakes. Not like bad luck. But like something that had direction behind it. Something planned. Something structured over time. I felt my stomach tighten slightly, but I didn't look away. The lawyer continued, and the words started connecting in a way that made my thoughts race faster. There were references to agreements I had signed years ago, but now they were being framed differently. Not as isolated decisions, but as part of a larger chain. A chain I didn't fully understand. At least, not until that moment. Because as I listened, I started recognizing something unsettling. The way those early introductions happened. The timing. The people involved. The encouragement I received at just the right moments, when I was the most desperate to succeed. It wasn't random. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt guided. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to stay calm, but my focus had already changed. I wasn't just listening to the present case anymore. I was reevaluating my own past, line by line, moment by moment. And that's when the second twist hit. The lawyer paused, then introduced another document. This one was different. It wasn't part of my case. It wasn't even part of the same timeline. But it referenced transactions that overlapped with the period right before my financial collapse. And the name attached to those transactions belonged to someone sitting in that room. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. I already knew who it was connected to. My breath slowed, but my thoughts didn't. Because suddenly the courtroom wasn't just about my bankruptcy anymore. It wasn't just about financial failure or business decisions that went wrong. It was about connections I had never fully questioned. Paths I had followed without seeing where they led. And now those paths were being traced in front of me. Publicly. Carefully. Piece by piece. A low murmur started spreading through the room, but it was controlled. People were trying to stay composed, but I could feel the shift. Something private was being pulled into the open. My mother finally looked toward my father. Just once. A quick glance. But it was enough. And my father didn't look back. That was the moment I felt something change inside me. Not anger. Not confusion. Recognition. Because I had spent 15 years believing my collapse was isolated. A personal failure. A chain of bad decisions that belonged only to me. But now, sitting in that courtroom, hearing everything laid out with precision, I started to see something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if it wasn't isolated at all? What if my failure had been part of something bigger? Something I was never fully shown? The judge asked for clarification. The lawyer adjusted the papers again, flipping to another section. And that's when the tone of the room shifted even more. Because now it wasn't just about history. It was about responsibility. The word landed heavily. Responsibility. My mind kept circling it. Who carried it? Who shared it? Who knew what, and when did they know it? I glanced again at my family. This time I didn't see confidence. I didn't see judgment. I didn't even see control. I saw tension. Carefully held, barely contained tension. Like people standing on the edge of something they had been trying to avoid for a long time. The lawyer spoke again, this time slower. More deliberate. Almost careful. And every word felt like it was pulling a thread tighter around the center of everything. A financial structure that had been layered over years. partnerships that crossed paths in unexpected ways. Decisions that looked independent on the surface, but now appeared connected underneath. And then came the part that made my thoughts stop completely. A reference to communication records. Emails. Meetings. Introductions. Not just mine. Others too. People I trusted. People I didn't question. People who had been part of my journey when I was trying to build something from nothing. My chest tightened again, but I kept my expression steady. Because I realized something I didn't want to admit too quickly. If those records were real, then the story I had lived through wasn't just about me trying and failing. It was about influence, timing, and choices shaped by more than I had ever understood. The courtroom felt different now. The air felt heavier, like every sentence was adding weight to something already unstable. Even the judge looked more focused, more serious, like they were seeing the full picture come together for the first time. And then came the moment that made everything pause. The lawyer stopped speaking. Not because they were finished, but because someone had just entered the room. I didn't turn right away. I didn't need to. The reaction told me enough. The silence shifted again, sharper this time. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Recognition. Slowly I turned my head. And what I saw made my thoughts freeze completely. Because standing at the back of the courtroom was someone I never expected to see again. Someone who wasn't supposed to be part of this hearing at all. Someone whose presence immediately changed the meaning of everything that had been said so far. And in that instant I understood something very clearly. This wasn't the end of the story being revealed. It was only the beginning of a truth I had been walking toward for 15 years, without ever realizing it. For a moment I couldn't move. The person standing at the back of the courtroom looked just as unsure as I felt, but their presence shifted everything. It wasn't just another witness or lawyer. The entire room reacted differently. Conversation stopped completely. Even the judge paused, waiting. And I knew instantly this wasn't part of the original plan of the hearing. The lawyer at the front slowly turned, surprised, then glanced at the documents again like they were confirming something. My father didn't move. My mother's eyes widened slightly, just enough for me to notice. My brother looked down for a second, then back up, like he was trying to prepare himself for what was coming. The person at the back finally stepped forward. And that's when everything started to fall into place. They spoke calmly at first, introducing themselves, but I barely heard it. My attention was locked on my family. Because their reaction told me more than the words ever could. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't someone new. This was someone connected. Directly. The lawyer adjusted the documents again, and suddenly the direction of the hearing changed. What had been a financial case, a bankruptcy hearing from my past and its connections, was now widening into something far more complicated. The new person began speaking about older transactions. Meetings that happened years ago. Decisions that had been documented but never fully explained. And with every sentence I felt something inside me tightening and loosening at the same time. Because the story being told wasn't just about failure anymore. It was about manipulation of information. About who was told what. And when. I finally turned my head fully toward my family. This time I didn't look away. My father exhaled slowly, like he had been holding something in for years. My mother's hands were trembling slightly now. My brother sat still, but I could see it clearly on his face. He had been expecting this moment in some way. The person at the back of the courtroom looked directly at them, then at me, and said something that made the entire room go silent again. Not accusations. Not anger. Just truth. They explained how certain decisions that led to my financial downfall were influenced by structured advice given at the time. Advice that I had trusted because it came from people close to me. People I never thought would have any reason to mislead me. People I shared a last name with. My chest tightened, but this time I didn't feel panic. I felt something else. Something heavier. Understanding forming in pieces I had avoided for years. The lawyer confirmed parts of it through documents. Emails. Signed notes. Meeting summaries. Things I had never seen fully at the time, or had seen without understanding the full context. Everything was connecting now. My bankruptcy case wasn't just a result of bad luck or poor decisions. It had been shaped by multiple overlapping influences, some of which I had trusted blindly because they came from within my own family circle. I felt my throat tighten slightly. But I didn't interrupt. Because I needed to hear it all. My father finally spoke, his voice lower than I remembered it ever being in my life. He didn't deny anything immediately. Instead he explained. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone walking through a memory they had carried alone for too long. He said he had believed he was protecting me. He said he thought he was guiding me away from bigger risks, but the way things unfolded, the way decisions were interpreted and passed along, created outcomes that no one had fully anticipated. My mother covered her mouth for a moment, her eyes fixed on the floor. My brother finally spoke too. And what he said wasn't an excuse. It wasn't denial either. It was regret. Real regret. The kind that doesn't try to fix the past, just acknowledges it. I sat there quietly, listening to everything unfold. 15 years of confusion, frustration, and self-blame started to shift. Not disappear. Not erase. But change shape. I had spent so long thinking I was alone in my downfall. But the truth was more complicated. And more painful in a different way. Because it wasn't just failure. It was misunderstanding layered over silence. When everything finally settled, the judge spoke. The case wasn't dismissed, but the direction had changed completely. What was once about assigning blame had turned into a deeper examination of shared responsibility and overlooked information. And just when I thought it was over, just when I thought the truth had fully revealed itself, the final twist came. The person who had entered the courtroom earlier, the one who had triggered this entire shift, walked forward again. They placed one final document on the table and said something no one expected. There was another case, connected to mine, but not from 15 years ago, from much more recent activity. Activity that suggested the same pattern had continued long after I had left that world behind. My breath slowed. My family froze again. Because if that was true, then the story wasn't just about what happened in the past. It was about whether it had ever truly ended at all. And as I looked around that courtroom one more time, I realized something I wasn't prepared for. The truth I had just uncovered wasn't the final answer. It was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that was still unfolding even now. The courtroom didn't feel the same after that final document was placed on the table. It was like everything had been pulled open at once, and now no one knew how to close it again. People shifted in their seats, papers were still in hands, but nobody was really reading anymore. Everyone was just waiting to see what would happen next. I stayed quiet. I didn't look at my family right away this time. I needed a moment to understand what I was hearing. The second case, connected to mine, but active in recent years. That detail didn't settle easily in my mind. For a long time, I had believed my bankruptcy story belonged to the past. Something painful, something finished, something I had survived and left behind. But now it was clear that parts of that same system, those same patterns, had continued long after I stepped away from it. The lawyer began explaining again, slower now. This wasn't about blaming anyone in the room in a simple way. It was about tracing decisions across time, showing how certain financial structures and repeated advice had created outcomes that reached further than anyone originally intended. And as I listened, something inside me started to shift. Not anger. Not confusion. Understanding. My father finally stood up properly. For the first time, he didn't try to hide behind silence or short answers. He spoke clearly but carefully, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally decided it couldn't stay inside anymore. He admitted that during those years, he believed he was making protective decisions. He thought he was guiding me away from unnecessary risks, steering me toward stability. But the way information moved between people, the way decisions were passed down without full explanation, created outcomes that none of them fully predicted. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. She just listened like she was hearing parts of a story she had lived through but never fully understood. My brother spoke next. His voice was quieter but honest. He said he had seen parts of it too, but never enough to fully understand the bigger picture. He assumed things were being handled correctly. Like I did. Like all of us did in different ways. There was no dramatic defense. No attempt to rewrite the past. Just acknowledgement. And that made it harder in a way because there was nothing left to argue against. I finally spoke. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just simply. I said I had carried the weight of that bankruptcy for 15 years thinking it was entirely mine. Every setback, every restart, every moment of doubt, I believed it all came from my own decisions alone. And in many ways it did. I couldn't erase that. But hearing everything now, I also understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't the only one in that story. The courtroom stayed quiet after that. The second case, the one mentioned at the end, was explained further. It wasn't directly accusing anyone in my family of wrongdoing in a criminal sense. It was part of a wider financial review involving old advisory patterns, repeated structures, and how decisions made in good faith could still lead to unintended harm when communication breaks down. It was complicated. Not black and white. Not simple. Just real. Eventually, the judge made it clear that both cases would be reviewed together, not to assign blame in a personal way, but to understand the full chain of events. to close gaps that had been open for too long. There was no dramatic conclusion, no sudden punishment, no clean ending where everything is fixed. Instead, there was something quieter. Pause. A recognition that truth is sometimes layered, and not all of it arrives at once. When the hearing was adjourned, people slowly began to leave. The noise of chairs moving, papers being gathered, footsteps echoing, it all returned gradually, like the world remembering how to move again. I stayed seated for a moment longer. My family didn't leave immediately either. My father looked at me not as someone above or below, but as someone trying to understand the distance that had existed between us for so long. My mother wiped her face gently, still not speaking. My brother stepped closer, then stopped, unsure if he should say anything at all. And for the first time in years, there was no wall between us built on silence or assumptions. Just uncertainty. But also something softer underneath it. Possibility. We didn't resolve everything in that moment. We didn't fix 15 years in a single conversation. That wouldn't have been real. But something important did happen. The story I had carried alone for so long finally became shared. Not erased. Not rewritten. But seen from every side. As I walked out of the courtroom that day, I realized the biggest truth wasn't about bankruptcy or business failure or even financial mistakes. It was about how easily misunderstandings can grow when communication breaks down, and how long people can carry blame without ever knowing the full picture. And sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering the truth. It's accepting that it was never just one story to begin with. Outside the building, I stopped for a moment before stepping into the sunlight. The air felt different somehow. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. Behind me, the past 15 years didn't disappear. But they no longer felt like a closed door either. They felt like something finally understood. And as I stood there, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the ending of everything. It was the beginning of learning how to carry the truth without letting it define me the way silence once did.